The Appalachian Mountains are the oldest mountain range on Earth. They were ancient before the dinosaurs walked, before the oceans took their current shape, before human memory had any beginning at all. People have been disappearing in these mountains for as long as people have been walking into them. Locals who have lived in the hollows and ridges for generations will tell you, if you earn their trust, that there are things up there that have never had a name. Things that were old when the first settlers arrived and will be old long after the last one leaves. Do not mistake age for wisdom. Do not mistake silence for emptiness. Welcome to Mr. White Horror. Tonight, 3 people walked into the Appalachians. What followed them out was not what they expected. Story 1. It wore the voice of someone he loved. Daniel Voss had logged over 900 trail miles in the 6 years before October of 2021, and he kept every single one of them recorded in a worn green journal he carried in the top pouch of his pack. He was 38 years old, a structural engineer from Knoxville, Tennessee, with a methodical mind and a deep, genuine love for the backcountry that his wife had long since accepted as the third partner in their marriage. He was not reckless. He filed trip plans. He carried a PLB emergency beacon. He had completed wilderness first aid certification twice. He hiked the way he engineered buildings, with careful attention to load-bearing details and a fundamental distrust of anything that couldn't be measured. He did not believe in ghost stories. He had grown up in East Tennessee and had heard every Appalachian legend available, and he filed all of them under the category of regional folklore, interesting but not credible. He set out on October 9, 2021, from the 20-mile trailhead in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, intending a 4-night solo loop covering approximately 38 miles through the southern section of the park. His route would take him north along the 20-mile trail, connect to the Appalachian Trail at Sassafras Gap, and loop back through the Hazel Creek drainage before exiting at Fontana Dam. It was a route he had researched extensively and partially completed before. He was looking forward to the solitude, the cold air, and the particular quality of autumn light that filtered through the hickory and tulip poplar canopy in mid-October. His wife called him at the trailhead. He told her he loved her. He told her he would check in by satellite messenger at 8 each evening. He shouldered his pack and walked into the trees. The first 2 days were everything he had hoped for. The trail was quiet, the crowds of summer long gone, and the forest was performing its spectacular October transformation in amber and rust and deep burgundy overhead. He saw a black bear on the second morning, a young male crossing the trail without any particular urgency, and he stood still and watched it disappear into the rhododendron thickets with genuine pleasure. He made camp each evening at designated backcountry sites, cooked his meals, sent his check-in messages, and slept well. He felt deeply at peace in the way that only extended backcountry time produces, that gradual quieting of the internal noise that accumulates from ordinary life. The strangeness began on the 3rd evening, October 11th, just after dark. He was in his tent at campsite 28, a flat area beside a small tributary of Hazel Creek, when he heard someone calling his name from the tree line across the creek. The voice was female. It was not loud. It came from approximately 50 to 60 feet away, somewhere in the dark on the far bank, and it said his name once, clearly and distinctly. Daniel. He sat up in his sleeping bag and listened. The voice called again. Daniel, come out here for a minute. There was nothing technically wrong with the voice. The cadence was right. The tone was right. What was wrong, in a way that landed directly in his nervous system before his rational brain had time to intercept it, was that the voice sounded like his wife. His wife, who was at home in Knoxville, 60 miles from where he was sitting. He unzipped his tent and shone his headlamp across the creek. The beam reached the far bank and illuminated nothing but trees and undergrowth, the pale, ghostly columns of birch trunks and the dark tangle of rhododendron below them. He swept the light left and right. Nothing moved. He called out, asking who was there. No answer. He listened for 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes. Creek made its steady sound over the rocks. An owl called somewhere up the ridge, nothing else. He told himself it had been the owl. He told himself that the brain, in certain states of near sleep, could map familiar voices onto ambiguous sounds. He was almost certain that was true. He zipped his tent closed and lay back down. An hour later, the voice came again. Closer now. It was on his side of the creek. He could hear it moving through the leaf litter, slow, deliberate footsteps accompanying the calls. "Daniel, Daniel, come outside. I need to tell you something." The voice was patient, not frightened, not distressed, not the voice of a person in trouble. Patient, almost conversational. He gripped his headlamp and did not move. He did not want to open the tent. That want was purely animal, and he trusted it completely in a way that he would later struggle to articulate. Something in him that had no language and needed none was telling him with absolute clarity that opening the tent was wrong. He sent an emergency check-in message through his satellite device. Not a distress signal, but a message to his wife that simply read, "Something outside my tent. Calling your voice, I'm okay. Don't call 911 yet. Tell me you're home." His wife's reply came 40 seconds later, "I'm home, I'm in bed." "Daniel, what is happening?" He wrote back, "Lock the doors. I'll explain tomorrow." The footsteps circled his tent twice, exactly as a predatory animal circles prey, testing, measuring, waiting. Then they stopped at the head of the tent, at the zipper end, and the voice spoke again, no longer calling his name, no longer maintaining any pretense of his wife's distance and warmth. What it said, in a voice that had shifted slightly from his wife's voice into something adjacent to it, something that had studied the source material but not perfectly mastered it, was, "You can come out now. I've been waiting a long time." There was a sound then that Daniel described in his later account as the worst sound he has ever heard in his life. It was a sound like something very large lowering itself slowly onto all four limbs. The tent fabric shifted slightly under a weight pressed against it from outside, and he could see the impression of something against the nylon at the head of the tent, the outline of something that was not shaped the way he wanted it to be shaped. He activated his PLB. He activated it not because he thought rescue would arrive in time to help him, but because he wanted the coordinates broadcast and he wanted a record that he had been at that location at that moment. Then he did the only thing he could do. He sat in the center of his tent, headlamp on, and he waited. He did not move. He did not make a sound. He did not answer when the voice called again, and it did call again, 3 more times over the following 2 hours, growing gradually more distant each time, as if whatever it was had decided he was not coming out and had begun moving away through the forest toward some other patience, some other waiting. By 4 a.m., the forest had returned to its normal ambient sounds. Birds began as the sky lightened. The creek continued over its rocks. He packed his tent in gray pre-dawn light and moved out at a pace that was close to running, covering the remaining miles to Fontana Dam in a single push without stopping for food or water until he reached the parking lot. His PLB activation had triggered a check-in call from the National Park Service. He spoke to a ranger for 40 minutes at a picnic table in the Fontana Dam parking area, describing everything in precise detail. The ranger did not dismiss what he said. The ranger told him there had been 2 other reports of unusual auditory experiences in that same drainage in the past 18 months, both involving voices that seemed familiar to the hikers who heard them. Daniel Voss has not returned to the Great Smoky Mountains backcountry alone since October 2021. He still hikes, still fills his green journal, still loves the backcountry in the way that serious hikers love it, as a necessity rather than a hobby. But he told the online wilderness forum where he first posted this account that something changed in him permanently that night. Not his love of the mountains, not his rationalism, which remains firmly intact. What changed was his certainty. He used to be certain that the world operated inside a defined set of rules. He is no longer certain of that. He said the voice was the least frightening part, the voice he could rationalize. What he cannot rationalize, cannot file under any category that makes sense, is the impression in the tent fabric, because impressions require mass, and mass requires something real. And whatever pressed against his tent in the dark beside Hazel Creek was very, very real. He just cannot tell you what it was. Story 2. SHE lived the same night 4 times. Renee Hartwell was 31 years old and 3 years into serious solo backpacking when she drove up to the Seneca Rocks trailhead in the Monongahela National Forest, West Virginia, on a Friday evening in late September 2022. She was a physician's assistant from Charleston, and her relationship with the backcountry had started as a coping mechanism after a difficult year and had gradually transformed into something she could only describe as necessary. She was not chasing adrenaline. She was chasing the specific silence that only exists miles from any road, the kind that scrapes the accumulated noise of professional life off the surface of the mind and leaves something cleaner underneath. She was good at navigation, comfortable in her gear, and had spent enough nights alone in the woods to be past the phase of hearing threats in ordinary forest sounds. She was calm and competent and completely unprepared for what began at approximately 11:15 p.m. on September 23, 2022. She had made camp that evening at a flat site beside Seneca Creek, about 6 miles in from the trailhead. The campsite was one she had used before, a comfortable level area with a natural windbreak of hemlock on the north side and a clear water source 20 feet away. She had eaten, hung her food bag, and settled into her sleeping bag by 9:30, reading by headlamp until her eyes grew heavy. She fell asleep at approximately 10, with the temperature in the low 40s and a light breeze moving through the hemlocks. She noted in her trail journal, which she wrote in each evening before sleep, that the night felt particularly still and that she was looking forward to what the forecast promised would be a clear, starry sky by morning. She woke up at 11:15 p.m. to the sound of a branch breaking nearby. Sharp and definitive, not the gradual settling crack of an old limb losing its grip, but the clean snap of something stepping on dry wood under deliberate weight. She lay still and listened. Silence. Then another snap further away, moving west along the creek bank. She relaxed. Deer, most likely. She closed her eyes. She woke up at 11:15 p.m. to the sound of a branch breaking nearby. She checked her watch. 11:15. She looked at it for a moment, confused. She had the feeling of having just experienced exactly this, the same sound, the same position, the same cold air against the portion of her face outside the sleeping bag. She sat up and checked her watch again. 11:15 p.m. She turned on her headlamp and looked at the wall of her tent. Everything was exactly as she had left it when she fell asleep. Her journal was on her right side where she had placed it. Her headlamp had been on its hook above the door. She had not been dreaming, or if she had, the dream had been so perfectly continuous with waking reality that no seam was detectable. She wrote in her journal, woke at 11:15. Branch snap. Same as before, check watch. Same time. Odd. She fell asleep again. She woke at 11:15 p.m. to the sound of a branch breaking nearby. This time she was out of her sleeping bag before the echo of the snap had fully faded, headlamp on, sitting upright, staring at her watch. 11:15. The journal entry she had made minutes ago was there in her handwriting exactly as she had written it. Beneath it, in handwriting that was also hers but which she had no memory of writing, was a second entry. Same words, woke at 11:15. Branch snap, same as before, check watch, same time. Odd, she had written it twice. She had no memory of the second time. She pressed her palm flat against the journal page and looked at her own writing for a long time while the creek ran over its rocks outside her tent, and the hemlocks moved in a breeze she could not hear from inside. She unzipped the tent and went outside. The night was cold and entirely still. The sky was clear and absolutely blazing with stars, the Milky Way a thick brushstroke overhead through the gap in the canopy above the creek. The forest smelled of cold water and wet stone, and the sharp, clean bite of hemlock resin. Everything looked and smelled and sounded exactly as it should. She stood beside her tent for several minutes, looking up at the stars, breathing deliberately, trying to establish whether she was experiencing some kind of sleep episode. A parasomnia, perhaps, one of those states where the brain generates a convincing experience of waking that exists entirely within a dream architecture. She pinched the back of her hand hard enough to leave a mark. She noted the mark. She was awake. She went back into the tent and forced herself to stay awake. She made notes. She watched the minute hand of her watch move through its full rotation, past midnight and onward toward 1 in the morning. The time was moving normally. Nothing outside the tent repeated. She began to feel foolish. She began to construct the sensible explanation. Fatigue-induced temporal confusion. A brief parasomnia episode. 2 journal entries made in a state of partial wakefulness with no memory of the second. She was a medical professional. She knew how unreliable human perception was, especially in altered states of sleep and fatigue. She was constructing this explanation with the methodical competence of her training when she fell asleep without meaning to. She woke at 11:15 p.m. to the sound of a branch breaking nearby. Her headlamp was on. Her journal was open on her lap. There were now 4 identical entries on the page, each in her handwriting, each reading, woke at 11:15. Branch snap, same as before, check watch, same time. Odd, the 4th one was still wet. She had written it in the last few seconds. She had no memory of waking 3 previous times. She had no memory of anything after the second waking. Her last clear memory was of deciding to construct the sensible explanation, and then the sensation of falling asleep involuntarily. Between that moment and the one she currently occupied, with a headlamp burning and 4 journal entries in her hand, she had apparently woken 3 more times, gone through the same motions, and returned to sleep, leaving evidence she could not remember producing. She spent the rest of the night sitting upright in her sleeping bag with her headlamp on and her journal in her lap, forcing wakefulness through sheer determined refusal to close her eyes. The night passed normally from that point. At 4 a.m., she unzipped the tent and sat outside wrapped in her sleeping bag, watching the stars wheel slowly toward morning. At first light, she packed her camp with the focused, deliberate movements of someone operating on no sleep and a great deal of unspent adrenaline, and she hiked out all 6 miles to the trailhead in one continuous push. She showed the journal entries to 2 colleagues at work the following week. They examined the handwriting carefully and confirmed that all 4 entries were in her hand, consistent pressure, consistent letter formation, no signs of forgery or imitation. One colleague, a neurologist, suggested a form of complex automatism, a state in which a person performs learned, habitual actions without conscious memory, brought on by severe fatigue. Renee accepted this explanation because it was the only one consistent with her understanding of human neurology. She accepted it and continued to accept it for approximately 4 months, until she had a conversation with another solo backpacker who had camped in the same site 2 summers before her, and described waking repeatedly at the same time, to the same sound, with no memory of the wakings in between, until she had filled an entire page of her own journal with the same sentence written over and over 8 times in the night. Renee has not returned to Seneca Creek. She still backpacks. She still seeks out that particular silence, but she chooses her campsites differently now, and there is one additional item in her kit that wasn't there before: a small digital voice recorder that runs continuously from the moment she enters her tent until morning. She has used it for 11 nights since September 2022. On 10 of those nights, the recording shows nothing unusual. On the 11th night, camped at a different site in a different forest entirely, the recording captures her voice, clearly and calmly in the early hours of the morning, reading aloud the same sentence over and over in a flat, quiet monotone for 43 unbroken minutes, stopping abruptly, and then returning to the deep, even breathing of uninterrupted sleep. She has no memory of it. She has listened to the recording many times. She has never been able to make out exactly what the sentence is. Story 3. The people in the hollow didn't know they were dead. Boyd Ketterman had been hunting the ridges and hollows of central Pennsylvania's Bald Eagle State Forest for 34 years before November of 2023. He was 52 years old, a former Navy machinist from Milesburg, who had learned to hunt from his father and his father's father, men who had walked these same ridges in wool and leather with bolt-action rifles, and an absolute, inherited fluency with the land that Boyd had spent his entire adult life maintaining and deepening. He knew this forest the way a man knows his own backyard, its seasonal rhythms, its game corridors, its weather patterns and hidden water sources, and the particular way sound traveled differently on still, cold mornings versus cloudy ones. He was not a man who got lost. He was not a man who saw things that weren't there. He was, in every observable way, one of the most grounded and practically oriented people you could find in Clinton County. He also cannot explain what he and his hunting partner, Gary Schultz, encountered on November 4th, 2023, in a hollow off the main ridge between Eagleville Road and the Susquehanna River drainage. They had set out from Boyd's truck on the Forest Service Road off Route 150 at 4:45 in the morning, well before first light, moving through the dark on paths they knew by feel and repetition. The plan was to push up to a long ridge Boyd called the Backbone, glass the clear-cut edges at first light for whitetail movement, and work back down through the timber by midday. It was a plan they had executed successfully 3 times in the previous decade, and Boyd had taken a respectable 8-point buck on the Backbone 2 seasons before. The morning was cold, in the mid-20s, with an inch of old frozen snow on the ground that made the walking noisy and the sign reading excellent. They split up at a predetermined point, Gary pushing west along the ridge face and Boyd dropping south into a steep hollow he had glassed from above the previous spring. He had been in the hollow for perhaps 40 minutes, positioned at the base of a large red oak with a good sight line across a narrow bench of level ground, when he smelled smoke. Wood smoke, hickory by the character of it, the kind that comes from a fire that has been burning for hours, not the sharp, fresh smell of a new fire, but the deep, settled smell of coals and long-established heat. He lifted his head. The smell was strong and coming from below him, further down the hollow where the terrain flattened toward a small, unnamed tributary he knew ran roughly east to west. He had never smelled smoke in this hollow before. There were no camps permitted in this section of the forest. There were no roads anywhere close to his current position. The nearest maintained road was the Forest Service track he had parked on, nearly 2 miles north. He marked his position on his GPS unit, a Garmin in reach that he carried on every hunt, and noted the coordinates. Then, moving slowly and quietly through the frozen understory, he worked his way down the slope toward the source of the smoke. What he found at the bottom of the hollow did not match anything in his 34 years of experience in that forest. There was a settlement, not ruins, not the foundations of a long-collapsed homestead, of which there were many scattered through the Appalachian backcountry. An active, inhabited settlement, consisting of 4 structures arranged around a central fire pit, where a substantial fire was burning in a ring of flat stones. The structures were built of notched logs, the gaps chinked with what appeared to be dried mud and moss, with rough plank doors and oilskin or some similar material covering the window openings. There was a woodpile against the south wall of the largest structure, stacked high and neatly split. There were iron tools leaning against the same wall. There was a cleared garden area visible between two of the smaller structures, the soil turned and mounded in preparation for winter, rows marked with wooden stakes. There were people, 4 of them visible in the early morning light, 2 adults seated on split log benches near the fire and 2 figures moving between the buildings engaged in some form of domestic task. They were dressed in clothing that stopped Boyd where he stood, not because it was strange in isolation, but because it was complete, head to toe, in the wool and heavy linen and leather of a century or more past. Not costumes, not the self-conscious reproduction clothing of historical reenactors. Worn, patched, functional clothing with the specific look of garments that had been made, used, repaired, and used again over many years by people who had nothing else. He watched from the tree line for a long time. The people at the fire were talking. He could not hear their words at the distance he maintained, perhaps 70 feet, but their body language was entirely ordinary and domestic, the gestures of people going through a familiar morning routine. One of the figures near the fire was an older woman with gray hair pinned up under a cloth cap. The other was a man of similar age with a white beard, smoking a pipe. The 2 moving figures were younger. None of them looked in his direction. He raised his hand to his radio, intending to call Gary, and stopped. He lowered the radio. He did not want to make any sound. Some instinct that had served him well in the woods for 3 decades was telling him with quiet but absolute authority to be very still and very quiet, and to not draw the attention of the people around that fire. He could not tell you specifically why. They were just people, old-fashioned, inexplicably present people in a hollow that he had walked through a dozen times, and in which he had never seen any evidence of habitation, but people nonetheless. There was nothing overtly threatening about them. It was not their appearance or their actions that generated the warning in him. It was something else, something he only found words for later, speaking to Gary in Boyd's kitchen over a bottle of bourbon that evening. He said it was like looking at a photograph. Everything was right. The fire was real. The smoke was real. The sound of their voices was real. But nothing moved the way living things move. Nothing had the quality of presence that living things have when you observe them without their knowledge. It was like watching a scene that had been placed there for him to find, assembled with great care and attention to detail by something that understood the visual components of human habitation, without quite understanding the invisible animating quality that makes a home feel lived in. He said it was the most frightening thing he had ever seen, and it looked like nothing more threatening than a family beside a morning fire. He backed away up the slope, slowly, one careful step at a time, watching the settlement as he went. He was perhaps 30 feet back up the slope when the older woman turned her head and looked directly at him, not in his general direction, at him, with the specific focused attention of someone who had known he was there for a while and had simply been waiting for him to try to leave. Her face, at that distance in that gray morning light, was the face of an ordinary old woman. He did not know what he saw there that made his blood drop 20 degrees in his veins. He could not describe it to Gary later in any way that didn't fail the experience. He turned and went up the slope without looking back and did not stop moving until he was back on the ridge, breathing hard in the cold air with his rifle across his chest. He called Gary on the radio. He said nothing was wrong. He said they should head back to the truck. Gary heard something in his voice and did not argue. Boyd filed a report with the Pennsylvania Bureau of Forestry the following week, providing his GPS coordinates for the location. 2 forestry officers conducted a site visit 10 days later and found a hollow with a small seasonal creek, second-growth timber, and no evidence of any structure, habitation, fire pit, cleared land, or human presence current or historical. No archaeological features. No foundation remains. No cleared ground. Boyd's GPS coordinates were accurate to within 15 feet. Whatever had been in that hollow was no longer there, He still has the GPS log from his InReach unit. He still has the coordinates. He has been back to the edge of that hollow twice since November 2023, standing on the slope where he stood and looking down at the empty forest below. On his second visit, in spring, he noticed something he had missed before. At the bottom of the hollow, in the precise location where the fire pit had been, there was a ring of flat stones, blackened on their inner faces. Not ancient, not weathered. The blackening was relatively fresh, the kind that comes from repeated burning over a period of months or years. Something had been burning in that ring for a long time. Whatever it was, it had known when to stop. Boyd does not hunt that hollow anymore. He still hunts the backbone, still climbs in the dark on November mornings through the frozen forest he loves, still reads the sign in the snow with the practiced ease of a life spent in these mountains. But he hunts with Gary now, always with Gary, and he always makes sure they are back at the truck before the light goes flat in the afternoon. He told Gary, on the evening after it happened, sitting at that kitchen table with the bourbon, that the thing that has never left him was the old woman's face. Not what was wrong with it. He has never found words for what was wrong with it. What has never left him is the way she looked at him, with patience, with recognition, as if she had seen people like him come to the edge of that hollow before, many times across many years, and as if she already knew with perfect, unhurried certainty that they never stayed.